The news in detail on the hour from the WOR newsroom. President Nixon tonight laid out for the American people what he intends to do about the North Vietnamese offensive in the South. He has given instructions to the military command that in 3 days, all North Vietnam ports from which weapons of war enter and exit are to be mined. The purpose, said the President, is to keep such weapons out of the hands, and we quote, international outlaws of North Vietnam. The President made a special appeal to the Soviet Union to help bring about an end to the war.
I particularly direct my comments tonight to the Soviet Union. We respect the Soviet Union as a great power. We recognize the right of the Soviet Union to defend its interests when they are threatened. The Soviet Union, in turn, must recognize our right to defend our interests. No Soviet soldiers are threatened in Vietnam. 60,000 Americans are threatened. We expect you to help your allies, and you cannot expect us to do other than to continue to help our allies. But let us, and let all great powers, help our allies only for the purpose of their defense, not for the purpose of launching invasions against their neighbors. Otherwise, the cause of peace, the cause in which we both have so great a stake, will be seriously jeopardized. Our two nations have made significant progress in our negotiations in recent months. We are near major agreements on nuclear arms limitation, on trade, on a host of other issues. Let us not slide back toward the dark shadows of a previous age. We do not ask you to sacrifice your principles or your friends, but neither should you permit Hanoi's intransigence to blot out the prospects we together have so patiently prepared. We, the United States and the Soviet Union, are on the threshold of a new relationship.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to the return of the repressed. Very happy to sit down on my black cushion with you again. It has been a while, but with what is to follow, I hope you will all rejoice, nonetheless. Maybe you'll say something like, "Damn, he pulled it off again." Another series that made agriculture both fun and interesting in ways that have me looking at the world differently. If so, help the show to grow and please tell others. Maybe write a review somewhere. Drop a comment. And if you haven't already signed up on Patreon, know that when you are left standing in wonderment tonight, after the show, there are plenty of more material on that platform for a small fee, considering the amount. Try to make sure not to sign up with Apple though, because they charge a lot extra. I make the same money either way, but it's still pointless for you to pay them to pay me. I often forget to tell you what music I'm using, so tonight will be set to the newly released jazz gem from Okonski. I think it's an American jazz trio. Not sure if they're from the Midwest, but I hope so. And their autumn-vibed album Entrance Music. The outro will be a Japanese masterpiece in the space acid stoner rock genre from the 60s by Far East Family Band, which I have gotten back into after a 5-year break. Now, let's get into a small recap. So far we have seen how the prerequisites of hybrid corn successful introduction came into place during the intermediate period of the last two food regimes. As the old was dying, its explanations collapsing in dust bowls, the new was coming into existence through world conflicts and the Rooseveltian interwar deal. We began acquainting ourselves with the agricultural minister of the empire in those days, a man named Henry A. Wallace, whose father had been an agricultural minister a generation before, because that's just how things work in bourgeois democracy. Wallace's plant-breeding doctors had done something to corn. Its novelty was not necessarily of an agronomical or even scientific nature, though as always that is what we are told. No, it was politico-economical, which demanded that other doctors of law and maybe philosophy, had already infiltrated the necessary apparatuses of knowledge production and legislation to have Wallace's corn presented as a very interesting viable solution to a whole set of problems. Just like the geneticists fighting Lysenko at the same time in Leningrad claimed to be apostles of a new religion without blushing, Wallace's proud sycophants were called prophets of plenty. Wallace Sr., Henry A's father, Henry C., had, as we saw, undermined one of the last federal bulwarks against an American agriculture controlled by an Interessegemeinschaft of seed merchants. In place of the federal socialist seed distribution program that had been running like a circulatory system of biodiversity, pumping in heirlooms from all corners of the world since Abraham Lincoln, there asserted itself instead the will of what we now know today as Pioneer Hybrid International. The Hybrid Corn Company is today a subsidiary of Corteva, which in turn is a subsidiary of who else but Dow DuPont. It is of course very fortunate for them that this introduction of hybrid corn on the market, which would come to change a 10,000-year-old foundation of farming, was not only made sure by their state politics as agricultural ministers of the 30-year-long interregnum of the two international food regimes, nor their economical power as one of the biggest, most ruthless seed merchants, but also by the fact that the Wallace family owned the farming publishing house Farm Progress, overseen by, I believe, Henry A's brother. Farm Progress have manufactured the opinions of US farmers since the Napoleonic Wars, and according to Wikipedia has the oldest known continuously published magazine, Prairie Farmer, launched in 1848. They also run, and here's a little list for you, American Agriculturalist, Northeastern United States, Carolina, Virginia Farmer, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Dakota Farmer, North and South Dakota, Farm Futures, national coverage over the whole of the United States, The Farmer in Minnesota, The Farmer Stockman, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, Indiana Prairie Farmer, Indiana, Kansas Farmer, Kansas, Michigan Farmer, Michigan, Mid-South Farmer, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri Ruralist, Missouri, Nebraska Farmer, Nebraska, the Ohio Farmer, Ohio, Prairie Farmer, Illinois, South Farmer, Southeastern United States, Wallace's Farmer, Iowa, Western Farm Press, California, Arizona, Western Farmer Stockman, Northwestern United States, and then Wisconsin Agriculturalist. And they told, I assume, the readers of all these magazines that they had nothing to fear in the politico-economical novelty of their seeds, which was that of a reification through quasi-sterilization, which performed the first truly successful commodification of a seed. It made its crop uniform for the sake of machine cultivation. It made it responsive to industrial fertilizers, dependent on biocides made in factories, and perhaps most importantly, it castrated it, forcing farmers to return to the capitalist who sells it because its offspring would not grow. That is why we call it a politico-economical novelty, since scientifically and agronomically speaking, sterile seeds are, as mentioned before, an evolutionary dead end. Quoting Puerto Rican journalist, researcher and activist Carmelo Ruiz Marrero, he writes, quote, Wallace promoted hybrid seed with evangelical zeal, and so helped transform the country's corn production. In 1933, around 1% of Iowa's corn came from hybrid seed. By 1943, the figure was almost 100%. By 1965, over 95% of the country's corn was from hybrid seed. Two pioneers, great profit. End of quote. Now, we have done much work on deconstructing the word evolution. So I think it would be wise to also put this crime in a more Mitchellinian fashion. The hybridization of corn has introduced a prohibition, or censorship if you like, into nature, as it bars all local inheritance of acquired characteristics, which also alienates the farmer, who in her alienation is forced to accept that all her and her past generations' life workings of selecting favorable traits was a taboo, not only no longer required, but forbidden, against the law not of nature, but the patents of artificial seeds.
Oh, hello! Come in. Sit down, do. Would you like a drink?
Sherry.
Sherry. Sherry?
Sherry.
Sherry. Do you like vegetables? I've always been fond of root crops, but I only started to grow last summer. I happen to think the cauliflower more beautiful than the rose.
Chin chin.
Do you grow?
Geraniums.
Oh, you little traitors. I think the carrot infinitely more fascinating than the geranium. The carrot has mystery. Flowers are essentially tarts. Prostitutes for the bees. There is, you will agree, a certain je ne sais quoi, very special about a firm young carrot. Excuse me. Do help yourselves another drink.
What's all this? The man's mad. Eccentric. Eccentric. He's insane. Not only that, he's a raving homosexual.
You beastly little parasite! How dare you! You little thug! How dare you! Beastly, ungrateful little swine!
Shall I get you a drink, Monty?
Yes, please, dear boy. You can prepare me a small, rhesus-negative Bloody Mary, and you must tell me all the news. I haven't seen you since you finished your last film.
Rather busy, Uncle.
To set the tone for tonight's episode, let me summarize the purpose of where our investigation is going to go from here. The Second International Food Regime, that began to arise in the mid-late 40s within the superstructure of policies overdetermined at the time by the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, built on top of an economic base, petrochemical motorization, which would run into a major crisis in the 70s for various reasons, as we shall see, was still a global wheat order. I bring this up and have made this the topic of this season finale because though hybrid corn had become the king of Iowa cornland, which, by the way, is where the House of Wallace is from, just like the foremost biopirate of the 20th century, friend of the podcast, Norman Borlaug. And that they had done so even before the second food regime had begun, and then king of all corn land in the whole of America before the second food regime collapsed. It was still not the king of all grains. It was not yet King Corn, as the classic Iowan documentary of the same name called it. And thinking about that documentary, which, wow, it must be 20 years now since it came out, if someone has some personal experience of how much of a cult corn must be in Iowa, or perhaps dirt on the very sus Cassidy family, which we don't have time to get into tonight, please let me know in the comments. Anyways, the bottom line is similar to a statement made in a previous episode about how, though hybrid corn was experimented with already in the insane radioactive 20s, but had to wait then until 43 to conquer its first state, it had to wait another 20 years until the collapse of the second food regime in the 70s to really show how much of a darling to the capitalist order it had the potential to be. That means that to understand corn's importance and its role, we need to know what the post-war political economy of food was all about, how it rose and fell, as undertitles in general like to put things. I know for a fact that we can pull that off tonight, and nothing will be the same ever again. So, welcome again to the return of the repressed, to the Cold Grain War, also known as Little Watergate, and the season finale of Parapolitical corn. From the beginning, at the center of the second food regime, its principal axis mundi, as it were, rotated the global circulation of food aid. Therefore, I will sometimes refer to it as the food aid regime to distinguish it from the first colonial diasporic food regime, which we will not talk about at all today. I think before I also called it the mercantile industrial food regime, because I have been reading many papers published since the beginning of this as a field of study in the 70s and 80s, and no one, even the original authors, still seems to be sure about the terms. Anyways, the point here is that this food aid was made up of wartime American wheat surpluses which continued to be reproduced after the war due to domestic and foreign political reasons. Above all else, there was a general incentive which sought to avoid the agrarian crisis of the 1920s and 1930s, which had intensified and repeated a second war. A war which in many ways solved remaining American class contradictions not satisfactorily tranquilized by the New Deal, as farmers again could sell their surpluses to Europe. War, as we shall see, is a bourgeois solution to agrarian problems. Full-scale peasant revolts and farmer rebellions are not. We have talked about this before, but in short, these farmers had been encouraged to take out loans to pay for expansion and modernization within quotes to meet the demand of their faraway relatives in the warring old home countries. But when European agriculture had recovered from the First World War and no longer needed to buy American exports, it sent US farmers into a depression that spread to all sectors of society and eventually the world. The reason why this did not happen again after 1945 are many. During the Depression of the 30s, 3 new apparatuses were installed to deal with the problem. The Commodity Credit Corporation, the CCC, and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, and the Farm Lobby. These were all born out of a democratic political coalition of the New Deal, which sought to neutralize the class conflicts of the landowners, the industrialists, and the proletariat. The landowners wanted to get as much money as possible for their food commodities. The industrialists wanted to see as low prices on food as possible, since that constituted a cost for them. It was arguably the most substantial part in the industrialists' reproduction of the conditions of the production. And it was paid for by their variable capital, aka the wages. The proletariat who received these wages wanted, of course, to spend it on other things than just eating. So in this, naturally, they saw eye to eye with the high bourgeoisie. However, as we know by now, agriculture was becoming more and more tied to large-scale industry as it depended on industrially produced means of production, tractors and chemicals, etc., and the demand for these things came mainly from the petty bourgeois family farmers in the Midwest, not the capitalist farmers in the South and the West Coast, who still made their world go around at the expense of cheap wage labor. Serf slavery due to loans and other financial tricks. So in this way, the high bourgeoisie still needed the land-owning petty bourgeoisie to make enough money to buy their shit and to expand. The idea then, by the apparatchiks in Washington, their think tanks and the many boards of directives, was, what if the state could buy the surplus which the market could not absorb? That would certainly make everyone's life a lot easier. Farmers can expand as much as they like. The industrialists get to sell as much means of production as the expansion can make productive. And the producers of those means in the factories can buy food as cheap as possible to still make this all go around. It's not free market capitalism, sure, but then again, capitalists, as everyone knows, except Milton Friedman, don't engage with the market for the sake of increasing its status as a concept of liberty. They want velocity. They want to piston pipe more shit out of it. And jokes aside, speaking strictly historical, the pre-war international food order, along with the gold standard and free trade, collapsed in the 1930s by its own internal contradictions. And these new state mechanisms were an effect of that, not a cause for them. This idea of the state subsidizing farmers and buying their surplus also gained a lot of momentum since in the 1930s the farmers had become very organized. Many were even doing more than flirting with the idea of communism. And so the Democrats, for the first time, knew that they depended on the votes won through foreign policy. I don't really understand how this was supposed to work in detail, but we don't really need to understand it in detail either, because again, in the end, New Deal theory, as we shall soon see, is not what solved the major issue of these class contradictions. It was more war and the export of class war. But basically, according to Harriet Friedman, that it's Harriet, not Milton, the food regime theoretician, which we introduced in the last Parapolitical corn episode, quote, "The CCC made loans to farmers against their crops at a rate calculated to create a specific ratio between farm and other prices. The loan rate worked as a minimum price, and when agricultural prices were below the intended ratio, the CCC accumulated agricultural commodities. The AAA, the AAA, regulated production through acreage allotments, but failed to prevent the accumulation of stocks by the CCC. By 1942, although wheat acreage was reduced by 13%, production had increased by 21%. As a result, the CCC wound up holding 519 million bushels of wheat, or 70% of the average annual crop during the previous decade." End of quote. We will return to the interesting issue of acreage reduction as a method of at least officially reducing production in more detail towards the end. But we can immediately see that the intensification of farming more than compensated for the reduction of land use. Though there was yet no big ag policy, for that we will have to wait for Earl Butz as agricultural minister of Nixon and Ford, this nonetheless secretly squeezed out small farmers who could not afford the costs of intensification, what we call modernization. The big problem overall, however, in the capitalist glitch between the CCC, the AAA, and the farmer lobby remained that of overproduction. Now, what to do with all that surplus? Well, dump it somewhere, despite its quantities being above effective demand on the world market as a whole. This global methodology, wouldn't you guess it, had a lot of vicious intended and unintended consequences, as it became not just a one-time post-harvest solution to an unforeseen problem, but an international food regime that would last for decades. Tonight's topic is, it's not like it's not like American capitalism. It just sold off its surplus after the war, and then we're like, okay, this is it. Let's settle here. Now we've reached a nice level. We got penicillin. People are, well fed. How about this? Let this be the peak of mankind. No. They need to continuously expand. Tonight's topic is really a masterclass in dialectics, because in the end, by the 70s, this American food aid regime had effectively negated the conditions that had initially reproduced its own causation. But not in the way one might first naively imagine when one hears the word aid, if one presumes that those on the receiving end of this aid will, by the grace of this aid, eventually come to need no more aid. That's anti-capitalist, we all know that. Furthermore, we will have good reason to revisit our theory about the delay of conscious opinion of the people, since perhaps the most famous aid event ever, Band Aid or Live Aid, one of the largest satellite link-ups and television broadcasts of all time, when an estimated audience of 1.9 billion people in 150 nations watched the live broadcast, which is nearly 40% of the world population. This was staged in 1985. that is to say more than a decade after the collapse of the global food aid regime and the subsequent world's richest government's decision not to revive the order and let the neoliberal food disorder take over in a Hobbesian nightmare. Now, despite the ignorance of coked out artists like Bono, who can't be expected to understand the workings of food reserves, long gone were the tragic days of actual national surpluses in the developed world and governmental aid as a Cold War strategy. Here now instead, and to stay, the farce of NGOs and philanthropists with stocks in the new multinational agribusinesses. Then again, the famine could be linked to Marxism, which is why they had a go at making a spectacle out of the farce. But we are jumping far ahead, and I'm being gloomy in my simplified summaries. Let's take this step by step, and let's start with Europe in the year zero, which quickly managed to recover from the Second World War due to American aid, and which in due time, like the US and the other settler colonial states, though very importantly, unlike the Third World, completed the agricultural revolution that took its economic base from mechanized to motorized in the 1950s.
We have given much aid to the impoverished peoples of Europe on simple humanitarian grounds. But as a countermeasure against the attempt by the Soviet Union to communize Europe, the American people saw the necessity for cooperating with the non-communist countries in a comprehensive bipartisan European recovery program, passed by Congress and here being signed by President Truman. This program, known also as the Marshall Plan, is designed to afford eligible nations that margin of help in credit and materials which they need to bring their overall economy back to health. Secretary of State Marshall, in placing the plan before Congress, stated,
"Why must the United States carry so great a load in helping Europe? The answer is simple. The United States is the only country in the world today which has the economic power and productivity to furnish the needed assistance. The 6 8/10 billion proposed for the first 15 months is less than a single month's charge of the war. To be quite clear, this unprecedented endeavor of the new world to help the old is neither sure nor easy. It is a calculated risk. It is a difficult program. And you know far better than I do the political difficulties involved in this program. But there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance as to what it is to be.
Harriet Friedman says in an introduction, quote, "The international food order developed as part of the larger economic and political arrangements of the post-war period. The immediate pressure on American food policy came from the costs of maintaining mounting grain surpluses arising from domestic farm subsidy programs. In the formative years of the post-war order, however, grain surpluses came to be not simply an economic burden, but also a resource in international relations. Specific policies to find customers for American grain in an impoverished world became entwined with attempts to solve complex political and military problems abroad. From the Marshall Plan through the Vietnam War, objectives came to shift, blur, and conflict, as American largesse was dispensed with a discriminating eye for building international alliances. End of quote. In Europe, this was not implemented with the same ethno-botanical and agro-cultural colonial brutality as it was in other places. First of all, since Europe already had bodies, a diet, traditions and food culture and land, infrastructure, etc., conditioned thoroughly by wheat. Most importantly, though, for Europe, it had trade defense mechanisms, protections, tariffs and restrictions, etc. It had those because it had also completed the agricultural revolution of mechanized animal-drawn cultivation in the 19th century, as well as its coupled transportation revolution towards the end of that century. So, though the USA was ahead in the development of the next revolution, this was probably the least asymmetrical contradiction of the global regime, since this trade defense against Marshall Plan dumping meant that money could be reinvested to continue to develop European agriculture, which quickly began producing surpluses, just like the USA. If we make a short timeline of the post-war food regime's strategy of neutralizing the contradiction of agricultural overproduction, we can see that it develops through the United States continually finding means to send its surpluses abroad. First in immediate war relief, when Allied European farmers were soldiers, then under the Marshall Plan, then during the Korean War, once Europe was saturated, which gave the regime time to somewhat stabilize into the module of aid to underdeveloped and developing countries in exchange for geopolitical alliances, culminating in another series of wars in Southeast Asia, which ultimately broke it. As Friedman points out, this process was for a long time uniquely available to the American state, which alone could afford to subsidize exports of its own stocks and of commercial transactions. Our guy, Henry Wallace, so believed in this model of getting rid of the surplus and making other countries dependent on American export through aid that he fought viciously to include even the Soviet Union in the Marshall Plan, which did not happen as the Marshall Plan sacrificed immediate American trade interests to the global strategies of the Cold War, i.e., to isolate the Soviet Union rather than making them dependent on American export. Marshall Plan aid in the form of food, feed and fertilizers constituted almost a third of the total aid of $13.5 billion between 1948 and 1952. It was geared both to providing immediate consumption needs during economic reconstruction and to rebuilding agriculture. Support for the reconstruction of European agriculture sacrificed historic important demand for American wheat to larger strategies for strengthening the European economies on a capitalist basis and incorporating them within the American alliance. The geopolitical opportunity and goal of all this necessitated that the American government bought so much wheat from its farmers that, quote, Marshall Plan and other foreign aid subsidized a 9-fold growth of wheat exports between 1945 and 1949 to 505 million bushels, a quantity far in excess of pre-war exports. Aid funds financed over 60% of all American agricultural exports in 1950. End of quote. By 1954, when European agricultural production had recovered and peacetime trade prevailed, total CCC stocks were 903 million bushels, equivalent to a year's production. Which is crazy if you think about it, that you should not only overshoot estimated needs by a margin, but have a planned economy which finds no way out of producing twice as much wheat as that which is demanded, assuming there even is a need for the standard year production. When in the mid-50s both the Korean War was over and European agriculture had recovered, the food regime had lost 2 of its initial major dumping mechanisms. Indeed, as we have seen, the aid had led to a greater surplus in need of dumping than before, which means that the first 10 years of aid had not solved the problem of overproduction and surplus disposal. it had exacerbated it by hundreds of millions of tons each year. But that did not concern the likes of Wallace, who had discovered what a powerful geopolitical mood of domination aid was, both domestically and internationally, in preserving the Pax Americana.
You say around the world the people look to the American farmer for food.
And the people around the world, especially the starving people, were looking to the American farmer to feed them. When I became President of the United States, I'm thinking about it, and I went to work to try to get it done.
217, 2720.
Kill your feedback. Kill your speaker out here.
Sound like their own sound.
Kill your speaker.
I don't know where it is.
Cut your cap.
Okay, here we go. We got it.
That's right. We're rolling. All right.
The small farmer needed help, and he needed it as quickly as possible.
The Mutual Security Program is just what its name says. It is a way to get security against aggression and war, through mutual effort, through the effort of many nations helping one another. This program is already in effect, and it is working successfully. The Soviet Union cannot achieve its dream of world conquest unless it picks off the free nations one by one. The Soviet policy is the old one, divide and conquer. Our policy is an old one too. In unity, there is strength.
East European countries were not immediately incorporated within the Marshall Plan, but Poland and Yugoslavia were quickly targeted as weak links in the chain of the excluded. As soon as Tito started distancing himself from the Soviet Union, aid started coming in explicitly tied to this geopolitical stance between 1954 and 1960. Enver Hoxha did not get any wheat for calling out this betrayal as revisionist, as one might imagine. If we break our chronology a little, we can see a similar trend in many other places. For example, Indonesia began to receive aid in 1966 as a Fourth Reich token of appreciation for the politicized mass killings of 1965 to 1966 and the anti-communist coup d'etat, so-called, as millions were being murdered. Egypt, once the breadbasket of the first European civilizations, now one of the sickest food aid Yankees of the 1960s, had its fixed abruptly cut off after the 1967 Middle East War and resumed only in 1974. In relation to this, it will surprise no one that Israel has consistently received aid. At the same time, as we have seen in early biopeace and warfare episodes, India and Pakistan, the two largest recipients of the whole program, are probably also the greatest representatives of the general policy of promoting capitalist development and combating Soviet influence through wheat dumping. The Indian Express highlighted, for example, in 2010, one famous story of how, quote, infuriated by India's criticism of American bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong in the course of the Vietnam War, the irascible Texan, they mean Lyndon B. Johnson, put food shipments on such a tight leash that India literally lived from ship to mouth. With every morsel we swallowed a little humiliation. When told that the Indians were saying exactly the same thing as the UN Secretary General and the Pope were, Johnson had retorted, quote within the quote, "The Pope and the Secretary General do not need our wheat." End of the quote in its entirety. Of course, this was nothing new, as the article historically highlighted. Lysenko's boys had been first to India in the early 50s. That aid, however, though smaller in tons, came with less foreign policy advice, within quotes. The Soviets, unlike the Americans, allowed both the non-aligned position of India, as well as good diplomatic relations to its border neighbors, most importantly China. Only when this attempt at neutrality by the newborn state was done away with, did Truman, before Johnson, allow the starving post-colonial subjects to be fed. I don't know sometimes if to call it post-colonial or neo-colonial, but I'll intermix in my prose. What is most important to understand here is that capitalist development in the third world, like India and Pakistan and the rest of the global south, was in this context made to function not only by tying them to the dollar and American exports, but by the way wheat aid destroyed the local peasantry, economically, politically, and culturally. We must remember that up until the post-war food regime of surplus dumping, these countries were generally self-sufficient agrarian societies. In addition, insofar that these peasantries were tied up in old European colonial trade relations and exploitation, which of course historically had plagued their autarky in other but similar ways, near destroying them meant strengthening the role of America against Europe. Crucial for the new world of free trade in the dollar was the proletarianization of that old peasantry and the commodification of its food, as this was synonymous with the extension of markets in grains to populations formerly engaged in subsistence and barter relations, i.e., relative independence. We see here then at the deepest processual levels a determination of an international division of labor and an international class formation. In particular, the significance of the international food order lies in its formation of capitalist relations within the world economy, by shifting vastly more of the world's population away from direct access to food and incorporating it instead into food markets. Just like centuries before in Europe, the Third World saw an urbanization at the expense of the countryside. In the case of these formerly self-sufficient societies, it would, unlike Europe, lead to the sweatshops of cheap goods that made parts of the Western proletariat feel like aristocrats, giving birth to the class-unconscious so-called middle class, interpellated to view themselves as consumers rather than workers, which neutralized class antagonisms in the capitalist core. The underdeveloping of the agricultural basis of these third world societies forced them to continue to receive the surplus dumping of motorized overproduction in the USA, which also continued to neutralize the class antagonism of the American farmers. A country which never had a peasantry, but instead petty bourgeois family farms of the Lebensraum homestead. An interesting class dynamic in itself, already introduced before, but which we will return to in depth in Season 2. How it was that the family farm came to stand at the forefront of the international food market. But for now, let's study how the incorporation of the Global South quickly arrived at a series of questions about the role of the dollar. Initially, as far as I understand it, aid was bought by the receiving third world countries in non-convertible currencies, tying them to the dollar in ways that was problematic for the dollar. As parts of its total value, if I understand this correctly, would be estimated in relation to many different currencies that were each in their own essentially worthless on the global market. I don't want to get too much into the quote-unquote pure economics of this because I don't really understand it, and views on its role seem to be very contradicting, but some of the monetary and financial aspects will be understood as we go along, as new amendments were added to the system to try to overcome this obstacle of over or under evaluation of the dollar. Returning then to our chronology. The post-Marshall systematic phase was first defined by Truman with the Mutual Defense Assistance Act, and then the Mutual Security Act in the early 1950s. If the dumping mechanisms of the Marshall Plan was officially aimed at recovering from war, the dumping mechanisms of the Truman plans, let's call them, were officially aimed at preparing and waging war against communism. This involved sending wheat to the royalists in the Greek Civil War, the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, the French colonialists and their compradors in the First War in Southeast Asia, the Shah of Iran, Israel, their allies in the Philippines fighting the communist Hukbalhap, as well as NATO build-up in Western Europe. There are, of course, many more incidents, but many are brief, and CIA-backed guerrillas do not constitute great enough a number to stabilize the price of Minnesota wheat silos, though, of course, it is amusing, perhaps not the right word, to imagine MK-Ultra radicalized Islamists in yurts on the plains of Xinjiang or the Albanian Alp caves snacking on some dry Graham crackers from friendly Dakota in 1949. This system was then reorganized under Public Law 480, also known as Food for Peace, within quotes, to give it that more, humanitarian flair, which we associate with the word aid. It consisted of 3 titles. Title 1 was designed to allow American grain to be imported by countries lacking foreign exchange for commercial purchases. Title 2 of PL 480 provided 4 grants to combat famine, and Title 3 for the barter of food for other raw materials. However, Title 1 sales rapidly became the largest component of American food aid. By 1956, food aid under PL 480 and the Mutual Security Act accounted for almost half of all economic aid. As Friedman explains, quote, "The foreign exchange bind of capitalist development in the Third World was superficially similar to that of war-devastated Europe. The Marshall Plan had been part of the general construction of an open world economy instead of the independent national development advocated by Keynes and others, which I imagine is some kind of like social democracy in one country, if you like, which is impossible, of course, but going on with the quote. American foreign aid was intended to assist capitalist development in the Third World, just as it had affected recovery in Europe and Japan on an open model. However, because of different political histories, food aid to agrarian societies did not have to include aid to agricultural development, as it had to do in Europe, and could accommodate the long-term pressure of surplus disposal. End of quote. You know, that's the old story, right? You give a you give a person fish, they eat for a day. You give them a fishing pole, well, they eat for the rest of their life, and they will not receive your wheat dumping. Going on with my own text here. Indeed, that accommodation was so central to this planning that countries which might develop a competitive wheat market, like Spain for example, were initially banned from PL 480 assistance. Quote, food aid in the heyday of the International Food Order was entirely directed towards feeding potential wage workers during industrialization, not toward agricultural development, end of quote. In addition, quote, the PL 480 aid was restricted to, quote, within the quote, friendly countries, and included among its official purposes the promotion of US foreign policy, end of quote. This is made evident by the fact that PL 480 decisions were made by the State Department, and in the early years of the program, 92% of local funds acquired through PL 480 sales were used as loans to recipient governments for approved development projects for payment of US obligations to them, and for procurement of military equipment, materials, and facilities. So basically, if I got this right, subsidized wheat was sold to geopolitically selected countries as aid. These countries paid in currencies that could not be converted to other currencies, but instead was lent back to those countries so that they could buy American weapons, training, and other technologies, etc., in the war against those excluded from this global food regime, generally the communist countries of self-sufficiency projects. The money was also used to build up the post-colonial repressive state apparatuses that could police the class wars that arose from all this food for peace. And to understand how the public law 480 exported the class war abroad in the first place, let's try to list some of the major contradictions. Since most countries attempting to industrialize adopted these cheap food policies, population growth quickly outstripped industrial employment once the peasantry was economically destroyed. Many became subjects of a new sub-proletarian class in a new landscape of global south shantytowns around its industrial centers. Since continually reproduced surpluses created a chronic downward pressure on the residual world price, quote-unquote, it meant that if agriculture nonetheless developed in the global south, it had to do so in a mutilated form, with forced specialization in search for profits, which resulted in increased export-orientated agriculture and food insecurity. Colombia, famous for a particular agricultural specialization, to say the least, illustrates the potentially extreme consequences of PL 480 imports for domestic agriculture. Even though Colombian imports were not important in total US wheat exports, they were crucial in shifting the sector balance within that country itself. A report on, quote, the side effects of foreign aid, the case of Public Law 480 wheat in Colombia, from the 70s by Dudley Leonard and Roger J. Sandilands, shows us that between 1955 and 1962, subsidized sales were made in pesos, which was overvalued in relation to the dollar, and accounted for 53% of total Colombian imports. Between 1951 and 1971, domestic prices for wheat were cut in half, and wheat production fell by almost 2/3. Domestic production, as a proportion of consumption, fell from 78% to 11%. This bankrupted traditional Colombian farmers en masse, who were forced to the slums to join gangs or to relocate to cheaper areas and specialize in other forms of agriculture. And the great irony that appears to me here after studying this in somewhat detail is that more than half the pesos were reloaned to the Colombian government for development projects, mainly in agriculture. The thing is, though, that many of these projects focused on opening up new frontiers, since the traditional agriculture was relatively easily converted towards global export, the Spaniards having established latifundias and plantations and haciendas and those estates for almost 500 years. These frontiers were often connected via US aid road constructions, which led to the most remote forested areas of Colombia, particularly the Amazon foothills and the southern regions, to which the displaced peasantry were forced to migrate if they did refuse the suburban ghettos. There they found poor soils, just like the mestizos had on their minifundios in the 1600s, when slave labor and serfdom was made illegal and they had to take care of themselves. Now, there was one traditional crop, however, with many qualities, which could grow in non-fertile rainforest soil. It was perennial, so its paste could provide an income in just a few months should one be stressed for cash due to loans taken out to build, well, any kind of infrastructure in the wilderness where the roads ended. The paste could even overcome the high costs of long transports, unlike most other bulky produce. What more, since cocaine is not a food staple, it did not have to compete with wheat on the world market. Neither is, nor was, the neo-Aztec economy of heroin in Mexico a food staple, which arose out of the same food for peace system before Mexico became the first Green Revolution experiment, which subsequently forced the displaced farmers into cartels and strike-breaker gangs, etc., in unforeseen numbers. And if you are still wondering why they couldn't compete on the wheat market, let's continue to state that it was a market where the initial post-war monopoly on aid had given such a long-lasting American advantage in relation to competing export countries that between 1956 and 1960, in the early years of PL 480, American aid accounted for almost a third of world wheat trade, and in 1961 to 1965, it had increased to more than a third. In that year, 1965, more than 80% of US wheat exports were financed by food aid funds, according to a US Congress report from 1977. During all these years, the American share of world wheat exports, aid and non-aid combined, increased from just over a third in the years preceding Food for Peace to more than half in the first half of the 60s. As formerly food self-sufficient nations, one after the other, saw its peasantry and subsistence farmers destroyed and sent off to the export sweatshop factories and the urban slums where they got hungrier and hungrier for the sake of this fucked up merry-go-round.
The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that our people are scientifically maneuvered by the white man into a life of poverty. Because we are forced to live in the poorest sections of the city, we attend inferior schools, we have inferior teachers, and we get an inferior education. The white power structure downtown makes certain that by the time our people do graduate, we won't be equipped or qualified for anything but the dirtiest, heaviest, poorest paying jobs that no one else wants. We are trapped in a vicious cycle of economic, intellectual, social, and political death. Inferior jobs, inferior housing, inferior education, which in turn again leads to inferior jobs. We spend a lifetime in this vicious circle, or in this vicious cycle going in circles, giving birth to children who see no hope or future but to follow in our miserable footsteps.
If we consult, as before, the US Congress, House Committee on International Relations, 1977, the use of food for diplomatic purposes, Washington, D.C., Government Printing Office, a document of 96 pages which I had to manually merge from TXT files to be able to work outside a US university. Because those are the levels of inaccessibility we are often at, dear listeners. we see that 11 countries account for 2/3 of all PL 480 aid between 1954 and 1975. Pakistan and India, which have already been mentioned, are at the top due to their size and role in the great game against Russia, which the Yankees inherited in this century from the British of the 19th. We have also already mentioned Egypt, Indonesia, Mexico and Colombia, though in no particular order of magnitude. So if we jump into number 3 on the list of thousands of millions of dollars, we will continue with Asian countries surrounding the Soviet Union, which the PL 480 reached. And here comes an extended list, which I try to make as exhaustive as possible. South Korea has been in the system since the get-go, for aforementioned reasons, but did manage, similarly to Europe, to a certain degree, to re-establish its own domestic agriculture. Though, obviously, they eat a lot more sandwiches these days than they did in the days of Choson. The aid was especially high during the Vietnam War and the junta of Park Chung-hee, since he helped make sure that more Korean farmer boys fought in the Southeast Asian conflict per capita than even America itself. Bit of an unforgettable gem to you, if you didn't know about that already, dear listener. Vietnam received almost the same amount as Korea at 4th place, but was unique globally in that all the money which they bought the aid with was lent back to finance its anti-communist army, or for defense purposes, as the Congress's Committee on International Relations put it, and which is the way that Nixon put it in the intro as well. The 5th largest benefactor was Yugoslavia, then Indonesia, both for reasons already mentioned. According to the report, Indonesia, and this is their uniqueness, remained a priority of increased aid even as the food aid regime was collapsing. But then again, if there ever was a domino brick, it was probably the collected force of those thousands of islands. On 7th place, we leave Asia and immediate geographic anti-Soviet interests and find Brazil. First, its bourgeois parliamentarians and their ruthless industrialization up until the mid-60s, and later its anti-communist military dictatorship, collectively the largest recipient of PL 480 in the whole of Latin America. 8th is Egypt, 9th Israel, then Turkey, 10, and finally Poland as number 11. As Friedman concludes, quote, "The transformation of self-sufficient agrarian populations into mass consumers of commercial food was the prelude to the foreign grain dependence now manifested in the underdeveloped world. Many new customers for wheat were created, but at a rate that outstripped the growth of employment. Capitalist penetration increased the absolute level of effective demand for wheat, but also increased the gap between the numbers needing wage employment and the numbers of jobs available. The demise of pre-capitalist self-sufficiency has created problems which remain, in different measures, unresolved in various nations of the Third World."
I'm going to show you how McDonald's builds a Big Mac sandwich. It starts here with a lightly toasted bun, and then a pure beef hamburger, sizzling hot, a slice of cheddar blend cheese, and some crisp, fresh lettuce. Then, our own secret sauce. The club slice, toasted, another hamburger, and a little more sauce just for good flavor, crisp dill pickles, and the sesame seed crown. This is the sandwich. McDonald's new Big Mac sandwich for the bigger than average appetite. McDonald's is your kind of place.
As we close in on the collapse of the last food order, We must understand that to most bourgeois governments of the industrialized world, all this installed a sense of security, not horror. Throughout the 50s and 60s, record harvests in the recovered industrial European and Asian agricultural countries, as well as the white settler colonies, and above all, the USA, was coupled with a technocratic faith among the policymakers. It often expressed itself in a conviction that the perpetual human plague of famine was eradicated. The real issue of modernity, the last 20 years at least, was, if anything, too much wheat. And this problem was seen only as a problem of overproduction, insofar that grain was a value form, a commodity which an excess of supply simply devalued, reduced the price of. Bog standard bourgeois classical economics. Then as the 70s started appearing on the horizon and the high bourgeoisie rather than the petty bourgeoisie family farmers, to say nothing of the subsistence farmers who still fed the world and they didn't even know what simple commodity production was, began calling the shots about what was to be done about this overproduction. The big players of the coming green revolution, what was now only a green dawn, Rockefeller, Ford, their recruited intellectuals and biopirates like Borlau, as well as the other industrialists of the motorized means of production, International Harvester, John Deere, Massey Ferguson, etc., as well as the big seed merchants, Wallace's Pioneer, the old German and Swiss chemical conglomerates of you-know-who, all began convincing policymakers that industrial, petrochemical farming and its monocrop specialization was making quicker face than anyone had thought in the Third World. Aid for inconvertible currencies, which had already begun being replaced by dollar credits and other niceties of the World Bank, would soon finally manifest in a new era of free trade. You know, warm countries making warm fruit, cold countries making cold roots, and temperate countries making temperate grain. And then everybody buys and sells and everyone is happy. No need for giant piles of unsold surplus and no need for aid. Let's get rid of it once and for all. What none of these freaks of bog-standard bourgeois economics seem to have understood was that overproduction have in the history of farming since time immemorial also been known as food reserves. It is not just a commodity like any other, and even to worshippers of the market, warning bells should have sounded about getting rid of it, since it had, since the end of the war, been the one major stabilizer of the price of grain on the international market. Did they realize that, or were they all busy coming up with cutting-edge models for what a world with or without a gold standard might look like? I want to say of course not, but maybe I am underestimating just how evil they are. You feel something brewing here, dear listener. I know. So to properly understand this, we need to understand another series of contradictions about the collapse and how famines returned to the world, creeping forth on 6 legs with renewed strength in the Coptic kingdom, long said to be the keeper of the Ark of the Covenant. First of all, the means of green dawn production introduced in the 50s and 60s initially increased the output per acreage, but it also increased the cost of production. We know this, and everybody at the time knew this, but it didn't become a problem for food commodity prices since it synthetically increased yields, as long as oil remained cheap for the motors and its synthetic agrochemicals. The increased cost of production was actually a complementary economic factor in the destruction of the peasantry, which we have seen in many other previous episodes. It also made sure that the soil bank programs in America during the 50s and 60s could begin reducing the acreage and still produce surpluses. But in terms of class war, it meant the beginning of the outphasing of small farms in America, when the government promised they would buy their old homesteads to extend pastures, forests, and watersheds. All good stuff, but we will see what actually happened to land once we are done with our lists of contradictions. In the United States, Canada, Australia, and Argentina, where arable land for wheat in total declined from 50 million to 30 million hectares, causing wheat production in these countries to fall from more than 80 million to less than 60 million tons. The food reserve was beginning to shrink. According to OECD reports from the mid-70s, American farmers were just half the numbers they had been in 1950, which represents a fall in the proportion of the farm population in the total from 15 to 5% throughout the entire regime. As a class of the nation, their political power was dwindling, even though their parents had fought for these policies a generation earlier, and their grandparents a generation before that, when the New Deal compromise seemed more plausible than the communization of agriculture in the second half of the 1930s. Not only did this favor the big ag players who had the economic elasticity to see profits in underproduction and a shrunken food reserve rather than overproduction, as acreage were reduced and cost of production rose. It also pushed them against consumer groups who wanted low domestic prices and less international dumping of the surplus. Sell it back home, they cried. We want cheaper bread. And for a while, the pilot food stamp program of 1961 to 1964 neutralized some of these tensions. Then came the OPEC crisis on top of all this hereto mentioned. And Western industrial agriculture began experiencing its first major economic class reorganization away from homestead farming. For suddenly, everyone realized that fertilizers had also been overproduced up until the 1970s. And so it came to be in our new favorite year of events, which we account as 1973, since the birth of the Aramaic in the old Sumerian lands where the wheat first came to domesticate our species, that the E04 crystals of the E04s were sold at a record high 3 to 4 times more expensive than 10 years earlier. In the aforementioned Iowan documentary, King Corn, and numerous other publications on the matter of the syrup substance which married gluttony and malnutrition in a single obscene object of desire, this is explicitly quoted as the beginning of the yellow kernel's rise to the top. Which means, I hope, that we can now already begin to see how it is connected to this crisis of the wheat aid order. The relationship between the price of fertilizer and the total cost of the commodity was not as extreme as today, where, for example, when you buy a cabbage in the supermarket, you'll pay up to 90% of the dollar to a Haber-Bosch nitrogen factory, rather than to the planter, maintainer, harvester, or the ancient owners of the land, the truckers who transport it, or the cashier who stocks and then runs the barcode for us when we depart towards the kitchen. But the Green Revolution, as mentioned, had begun to be introduced, which meant that to the extent that investment in fertilizer by farmers was organized privately, generally required higher prices than those of the late 60s. A lot higher to people whom for 20 years had gotten used to prices as so fixed, so reassuring by the grace of the state, that the capitalist core appeared to be a planned economy of the Comintern. All of these contradictions had the potential, I believe, to develop by themselves or in combination to such antagonistic levels that the international food order could not overcome them. There was, however, as we shall soon see, a very interesting Cold War catalyst, which made the 1972-1973 year into an event, in my opinion, far more important than the collapse of the Brettonwoods system, which is usually pointed at as an explanation for the change that took place by the beginner law apprentices of world history. But first, Friedman says the following about the crisis in general. Quote, that is to say, the operation of the international food order as a whole gradually changed their relations, both national and international, on which the order had been premised. As a result, a new relation began to emerge between supply and demand, leading to higher prices and to the collapse of the arrangements constructed over 2 decades. First of all, although unemployment and poverty began to increase too in advanced capitalist countries in the 1970s, the scale of the aggregate gap between the human need for food and the ability to purchase it was vastly greater in the huge urban conglomerations of the underdeveloped world, created in part by the international food order. These concentrations of people were in advance of industrial employment. The number who could buy wheat increased sufficiently to solve much of the world problem of commercial surpluses, but insufficiently relative to the numbers who needed to buy it, but could not. End of quote. Then at the same time, in this dialectic of relative and absolute numbers, Brezhnev, in a rather interesting revisionist move, which was mirrored in the First World with more intensity, had decided to increase the meat consumption of the subjects of the so-called Second World, which up until now had been attemptedly barred from the international market of grain. Khrushchev's corn programs had failed to provide feed for this great leap into the Western model of meat consumption, so the products would have to be bought internationally. The bovine head, ram feet and swine heart of Moloch told people all over the world to indulge in the fruits of his own body, to show off their affluence, even though we could not afford to feed him.
Mr. President, can we trust the Russians?
Well, I recall talking to Manuel Brosio, the former Secretary General of NATO, a great Italian diplomat who served 6 years in Moscow before he came to the United States. And he told me in the late 60s, before I became president, very, very vigorously, when many Europeans were clamoring for détente, he said, I know the Russians. They are liars. They are great actors. They are cheaters. And they lie and they act because they consider it's their duty to do so. He says, you cannot trust them. Now, having said that, however, he did not go on to say that you should not deal with them. And my answer to this whole proposal or question as to whether or not the Russians can be trusted is very simply only if we make agreements which are in their interest to keep, self-enforcing agreements, and only if everything we do with them positively is linked to something else which will cost them if they break the agreement. But you can't trust them on the basis that, well, we're sincere and they're sincere. That is totally irrelevant where the Russians are concerned.
Why do they lie and cheat? Why are they insincere?
The reason is that their goal is very different from ours. To simplify it, our goal is peace as an end in itself, and their goal is victory. And whether it's peace or war, it's a means to the end of victory, the Soviet or Russian or communist domination of the world. And under Marxist-Leninist teachings, you use any means to achieve that great goal. And if it requires that you lie and you cheat, you lie and you cheat. Now, under the circumstances, we simply do not follow that particular type of, quote, morality, unquote. And under the circumstances, however, in dealing with them, it doesn't mean that we have to lie and cheat, but we must be aware of the fact that they will when they can get away with it. But on the other hand, you can deal with them and they will keep a deal if you make it on basis that will serve their interests.
I hope to return to Khrushchev's corn plans in a future episode, but I felt that saga much too connected to Lysenko to be able to provide a full account of it in this series. What we need to know in that story's stead is, as Brian L. MacDonald writes in his book Food Power, The Rise and Fall of the Post-War American Food System, that, quote, the first of the unexpected events that led to the destruction of the post-war food system was the 1971 decision by President Nixon to regularize exports from the United States to communist countries, end of quote. When Mao Zedong and Brezhnev eventually met Nixon in 1972 and 1973, it became a sign of the times that the so-called détente, i.e. the general easing of geopolitical tensions of the Cold War, was now in effect, which meant that grain trade could take place over the Iron Curtain. Nixon, of course, knew that the Soviet Union had begun adopting this new policy of increasing consumerism based on an American dietary model already in the late 60s. So the timing could not have been more perfect, he thought, but for very wrong reasons, as he looked back over 20 years of wheat price stability, not a single harvest forward of something very different. The pressure to meet the Americans for Brezhnev was coming from the extremities of the Union, with the Prague Spring in 1968 and the December 1970 protests in Poland, which resulted in a 40% increase between 1968 and 1971 in the use of feed grains for animals. An interesting point to bring up in an argument if you're a vegan with some modest tanky inclinations. Grain production was increasing in the Union, but it would simply not be able to reorganize its use towards the cattle industry to meet the demands of everyone having multiple Big Macs a week. The double-decker burger had just been released in 1967, the same year that McDonald's went international. Initially, the Americans came to the Russians. After all, it was probably they who wanted to get rid of a lot of surplus, and everyone knew it was not aid given out of goodwill. We have already been given more than ample examples of that. Furthermore, seeing as the Third World was taking so long to develop and industrialize, that is, that they were bravely resisting in places like Haiti and in numerous other struggles no longer remembered, against having its peasantry and food security destroyed for the sake of proletarianization and a wage for food subjectivity, meant that the Americans were stressed to see the miraculous progress of the Second World open up its markets to all that previously dumped wheat and engage in proper trade. At least they had proles short for options to avoid this dietary change towards slop. Nixon's ag boys were so sure of themselves and their modus operandi hitherto since the end of the world wars, that they were even willing to subsidize the sale and provide loans which they thought would be a sure way of trapping the Soviets in the same cycle of dependence as their previous targets, and the trade would come later once the people of communism got used to eating Big Macs in this soft to medium power show of force. According to the Federal Reserve Bank, the deal called for the Soviet Union to purchase 433 million bushels of American wheat for about $700 million. They also agreed to purchase 246 million bushels of corn and 37 million bushels of soybeans, which brought the total sale to a staggering 1.1 billion American dollars. The largest sale of food in American and surely world history. An important condition of the deal was that the United States shipped the grain before the 1973 planting season. Speed was of the essence, as we shall soon see, for the 433 million bushels of wheat purchased by the Soviet Union was a substantial amount of the global food reserves and represented 1/3 of American wheat production in an average year. The sale used up half of the stocks of wheat stored by grain dealers in the United States. This meant that to replenish its stores, America needed at least an average wheat crop in 1973 to keep not only its own people happy, but all those millions caught in their net of surplus dumping over the last 2 decades. Global grain stocks were further depleted when the Soviet Union also purchased large amounts of wheat from Canada and France. The Soviets bargained well and bought the grain at a good price. The loans and concessions, which can seem very forthcoming by the West, was also of course a question of the hard power show of force in Vietnam, which was tearing the American and West European home front to pieces, regardless of Big Mac prices. The Western thinking went something like this: we will do this deal in secret, you'll get a good price, no shame in trading. As long as you step down from this whole debacle in Southeast Asia, we can go our separate ways, no longer as warring enemies, but business associates. Let's forget about the murdering of millions of innocent rice farmers. The colonial days are over. What do you say, mon amour? McDonald's writes, no pun intended, concerning the Big Macs, quote, in April 1972, while he was in Moscow meeting with Soviet officials to secretly negotiate grain sales, Earl Butz, Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, received a cable from the U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, conveying Nixon's instruction to delay the negotiations so that they would not disrupt the Moscow summit scheduled for the following month. This cable followed another communication to Butz from presidential aide Peter Flanagan, reinforcing the president's wish to use grain sales to pressure the Soviet Union to support positions favorable to the United States in Vietnam. For its part, the Soviet Union was taking a hard line on the terms of the deal. The negotiations were therefore not resolved in April and were instead delayed until a May visit to Washington by Russian Minister of Foreign Trade Nikolai Patolichev. End of quote. Nikolai Patolichev seems to be a cool guy. He was from a poor to middle peasant family that rose to prominence during the Lysenko days, a Komsomol activist since his youth. That's like the Leninist youth brigades, right? Hero of Socialist Labor, Order of Lenin, Order of the Red Banner of Labor, many others, and by all accounts a true believer who had survived a lot of exiles and repositionings during the turbulent years of different leaders and revisionist takeovers. Beria, the infamous head of the secret police, hated him and he hated Beria, which is often a good thing. Not for him personally at the moment, but for historical rehabilitation, it's a good thing, I would imagine. He had been in the Minister of Foreign Trade since 1958 and would remain so for a total of 27 years, a position usually held for a 5-year plan on average, making him by far the greatest trader in Soviet history, and we are about to see why. He seemed to have known where history was going. The bourgeois world was planning the end of the food regime, and Western governmental actors were to be replaced by international big ag, which saw famines and a depleted global food reserve as nothing but economical categories in a chaos of markets for which there was yet no name. Most importantly, maybe he even knew a little about what was about to happen to wheat prices by the next harvest. For the kolkhozes, the collective farms of the Soviets, which stretched almost half around the world's arable land, burdened, said some, by iron directives to report everything in detail to Moscow, had already begun analyzing the consequences of the great global drought of 1972-1973, which would come to be known as the greatest of the century in many places, on many continents, among many a people. So if it seemed in 1972 that the United States had scored a great victory for free nation agricultural systems over communist-controlled systems, by 1973 it was becoming clear that the Soviets had gotten the better part of the deal. In the summer of 1972, which the Yankees would get to know as the Red Fiery Summer, Highlanders and Lowlanders formed the last alliance, joining the Vietnamese People's Army to perform the largest anti-capitalist intervention since that winter when 300,000 Chinese rice farming volunteers had crossed the Yalu River into North Korea 20 years before, refusing to be cowardly starved to death by the dark forces that had mined every port of North, South, East Asia. At that time, export prices for wheat was at $1.68 per 36-liter basket called an imperial bushel. By August 1972, it had risen to 2.4 per bushel, and it would keep increasing, up to 4.45 per bushel by August of 1973. But by then, it was already leaving the American harbors in millions of tons by the work of unionized longshoremen, destined not for the Republic, but the People's Republic of Vietnam. As McDonald's points out, quote, the stability of wheat prices over the preceding decades had left to the belief among policymakers and economists that the current high prices were not sustainable, and the spike was seen as a temporary reaction. This led the United States to keep the subsidized export price for wheat at 1.63 per bushel through September 1972. As a result, the cost of domestic farm subsidies in the United States more than tripled from the $67 million projected for 1973 to $300 million. The domestic price of wheat almost tripled between August 1972 and August 1973, while price of corn and soybeans more than doubled. Increases in the cost of feed grains were passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices for meat, such as 150% increase in the price of chickens by August 1973. End of quote. As scoops of the secret deal with the Soviets started leaking to the press, we do not know by whom, but there are accusations against both the CIA and the KGB, the Western press started lamenting like paid Korean whalers over the fact that it was the Soviet Union and not an Anglo-American multinational that had made the first free market move of the collapse. In the fall of 1972, the Moncton Times in Canada, the Daily Advance in Virginia, the Daily Item in Massachusetts, Public Opinion in Pennsylvania, Victoria Advocate in Texas, News Press Florida, Goldsboro News Argus North Carolina, the Muskegon Chronicle Michigan, the Daily Sentinel Alabama, the Vicksburg Post Mississippi, Desert Dispatch California, the News Virginia Virginia, the Daily Non-Pareil, Pareil, some stupid French word, in the French flag state of Iowa, the Bastrop Daily Enterprise Louisiana, and I could go on for a total of 38 matches according to newspaper.com alone in North America alone with the same title alone, because they all ran the same headline: Lesson in Soviet Grain Deal. And I'll read you the Evening Standard of Pennsylvania, October 11th, 1972, dear listeners. Lessons in Soviet Grain Deal. Some people are beginning to call the Great Grain Deal between the United States and the USSR the Great Grain Robbery. The fact that the Soviet Union, the oldest communist country in the world, had to ask for help in feeding its people to the tune of 1 billion in capitalist grain has hardly been commented upon. First came charges that some grain dealers had made windfall profits at the expense of farmers. The government denies it and the dealers deny it. One of them even went so far as to ask for a tax break as a reward for helping promote exports. The shamelessness. These people stand for absolutely nothing. Most recently, there have been reports in the financial press that the Russians outsmarted the dealers at their own capitalist game by tough bargaining and by playing their cards close to their chests. They succeeded in buying up vast quantities of wheat, feed grains, and soybeans without bidding up prices. By way of icing on the cake, half of the 1 billion of the Soviets are spending in the largest grain purchase in history. That's $500 million was borrowed from the United States. On the political side, one writer suggests that the reason the Soviets made no protest over the mining of Haiphong Harbor, which many feared would wreck the pending summit meeting with President Nixon, was that the Kremlin knew early in the year that there was going to be a poor harvest and that Russia would have to come knocking on the U.S. granary door. Yeah, well, they sent the wheat there anyway, so... Others grumble that the United States missed a chance to extract significant concessions from the Kremlin, such as putting more pressure on North Vietnam to make peace. Despite all this, the fact remains that after nearly 55 years of rule in Russia, the communist system has not yet solved that country's problem of chronic agricultural deficiencies. That's not the take, man. That is not the take. This means there will likely be other grain deals in the future. Maybe we will have learned something from this experience. Okay, end of the article in total. Adding insult to capitalist injury, the Soviet Union then went on to aid not only the Vietnamese, but to really throw it in their face when the global drought finally arrived in India, and Delhi was told by Washington that they did not have any wheat to sell because they had gone all in and gambled it away. The Soviets said, you can have enough millions of our Yankee grain to make sure your people don't starve. The New York Times, which wanted to herald the neoliberal order before it even came to fore, before anybody knew this term, first spoke of the deal with the words, quote, The United States and the Soviet Union, like the United States and the Chinese People's Republic, are giving public demonstration of their willingness to have business-like relations and to reach mutually beneficial agreements. End of quote. But a few months later, when bread, possibly even a homemade Big Mac, was cheaper in the planned economies of the East than in the free world, which even led Treasury Secretary George Shultz to admit that the United States had been burned on the grain deal with the Soviet Union, the New York Times now called the quote-unquote business-like relations the Little Watergate. And when even senators who had been kept in the dark, like most others, started to scream that on the floor of Congress, the FBI began their investigations of corruption and, behind-the-scene deals among the big ag merchants. They didn't find anything, of course, wink wink, but more on that later. To appease the situation, Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, then went on to implement the new corporate economic model of the collapse under the maxim to get big or get out. He called out to end all conservation diversion programs and put 60 million acres of fallowed cropland back into production in 1974, basically in one season, undoing 20 years of ecological conservation work. When it became clear that Canada had entered into an agreement to sell up to 224 million bushels of wheat to China, a sale worth more than the Soviet $1 billion deal, in a move that was expected to boost prices beyond the record level of 5.6 per bushel, Butz encouraged full production by exhorting farmers to plow fence row to fence row, quote, within quote, so that the United States food arsenal would never again be empty and it would be able to once again yield quote-unquote agri-power to enhance American national security. Suddenly, all that land, sold by small-time wheat homestead farmers during the 50s and 60s, was bought back not by the government to give back to Turtle Island what had been stolen from the soil, the Great Plains, the woodlands, its animals and peoples for generations, but by the owners of the biggest threshers in agricultural history. And they began planting corn like never before. McDonald's tells us that when in November 1974, global leaders gathered in Rome for the World Food Conference, quote, global grain reserves had fallen from a high of 95 days worth in 1961 to just 26 days in 1974, the lowest level in more than 2 decades. Because of the large amounts of wheat, along with other crops in storage during the 1950s and 1960s, any fluctuations in production caused by short-term policies or bad weather had resulted in only minor fluctuations in price. For example, in 11 of the 12 crop years between 1960 and 1971, wheat prices stayed within a relatively stable band of 59 to 65 per ton. Prices of corn and other surplus grains followed a similar pattern. The depletion of grain reserves removed this buffer between events and prices. Of major grain importing countries, only India took steps to increase stocks in response to policy shifts in America and other grain-producing nations. Time reported in November 1974 that nearly 500 million people suffered from some form of hunger. 10,000 people were dying each week in Africa, Asia and Latin America, and in India alone, 30 million people were facing starvation. Discussions, so like oh yeah, who is it that can't feed people then? Like, it's clearly your system. 30 million people facing starvation in the 70s, even though this was the most, heralded experiment of the Green Revolution. Huh? Wow, good job. Going on with the quote. Discussions of a renewed investment in global food reserves and other global initiatives to stabilize food supplies followed. But what these discussions revealed most clearly was that what replaced the post-war food system was no system at all, but a loose and ever-shifting global network of producers, manufacturers, marketers, and consumers. This network was, and remains, difficult to stabilize in the face of famine, food safety scares, environmental concerns, and the many other challenges that confront the global food supply. End of quote. And I think, if you ever looked, this works for any kind of like statistics, but like when you look at production of these grains, like the big ones, soybean, wheat, and corn, like you see that like they drop and fall and rise time and time again, right? Like what everybody's talking about now with bitcoins and stuff. Like that's basically the behavior of grains almost all the time after the 70s. Like really high spikes upward and downward. But of course, like that's only when you calculate right from one year to another. I'm not saying that these spikes are actually translated as what he was just talking about, starvations and things like that. But the economical trick, right, is that when you do, if you can smooth it out, like what I keep saying, if you have the economical elasticity to look at it over a 5 or a 10-year period, of course these spikes become less aggressive, but only for the people who have enough capital to sort of expect those kinds of or that kind of like economical foresight. They're the only ones who can take benefit. Like there is a benefit to be had in destabilizing the market, but not for petty bourgeois traders. Only like the really big high bourgeois traders, obviously. And also, like, poor India, right? Despite being the only bourgeois democracy which tried to build up a domestic reserve, like the planned economies, they were already hooked on this green revolution, and millions would die every year, continuing up until today. And fucking Norman Borlaug, man, when he was questioned about this snake oil solution then in 1974, and why the miracle he had promised in exchange for, Rockefeller paychecks were drying up, do you know what this motherfucker said? Quote, "Our efforts to buy time have been frittered away because political leaders in developing nations have refused to come to grips with the population monster." End of quote. It's the most racist fucking thing I've ever heard. His solution doesn't work, and when confronted, but it wasn't like any person had to say to him it didn't work. History itself, while he was still alive, showed him your solution was a no solution. You were full of shit. Your whole career is bullshit. You're not an agronomist. You're just a paid, recruited intellectual. Then he goes for, oh yes, black people have too many babies. It doesn't matter what I would do with my white burden. Oh, they just fuck too much. No, nothing can be solved about this. Jesus Christ, man! Like these people. Now, I don't know if to make this joke about it, but like, really, like when you buy naan bread from the devil, you also have to accept to be sterilized and compensated with a Walkman, I guess. But I think, like, more about like these kind of record numbers that eventually did outmaneuver even the bourgeois eugenicists and the Nazi race hygienists, like combined. When we do get into population control in the next Skullboy series, that's when we will deal with this. I'm getting too worked up. I need a stabilizer. I need my comrade Sebbe to be able to talk about this shit here. Anyway, going on with my own text. So, though by my reckoning, the grain heist event helped end the Cold War in 1973, the Soviets could ultimately do nothing about the ushering in of a cold peace in its wake. And I'm well aware that usually the Cold War is said to have ended in 1989, but my take is that it ended already in 1973. Then we had a cold peace instead, when it was no longer like nations fighting each other in the same way, but multinational corporations trying to undermine the Soviet experiment. Crisis after crisis, after all, are not an obstacle to capital. It is the very propeller which pushes it onward. And its forward movement in that future, our future, took the form of a neoliberal lack of food order, of population control as a bioweapon, as laissez-faire hyenas began recognizing coming droughts in the absence of a system of reserves as volatile conditions for food commodity speculation. The world most of us were born into, which we are only now beginning to escape from under Chinese leadership with a very different agricultural politics, which begs the ultimate question. Did those who ultimately came out victorious for a coming half-century, did they, to some degree, prepare that chaos, which the Soviet trade delegation also foresaw? Had they already picked the 1972-1973 drought, arguably the worst of the century, as the crucial D-Day for all of tonight's contradictions to come together before it even happened? Let this remain a speculation of premonition until the next season, of how much the powerful actors hiding behind the Interessegemeinschaft we call Big Chem Ag and neoliberalism actually knew and know, could and can plan for when they rode to meet the collapse of the last international food order in mankind's history, hitherto. And it's not a wild speculation, because of all the things I have suggested so far to have happened in this fateful 1972-1973 year, as to make it a threshold, be it Hoovers' death, Brettonwoods, the building of the World Trade Center, the beginning of the War on Terror, the end of the last war against communism, the OPEC crisis, get big or get out, etc., etc. None is greater than what I'm about to share with you now. 10,000 years from now, this is what will be remembered, while all else is forgotten. For do you remember that a long time ago we talked about the ancient influence of Jupiter on the Sun, and how observation of that relationship in olden days could be correlated with black spots in the body of the highest, most praised celestial sphere that maketh all things grow, and that careful study of those spots would make for the author a logbook which would acknowledge all great famines and major upheavals among mankind since time immemorial until the French Revolution and beyond. And do you remember, dear listener, how I did not dare to utter the word of Enso when speaking about the late Victorian Holocausts, possibly the greatest single instance of extermination our species have lived through? Because even though El Niño Southern Oscillation, as it is also known, did play the major cosmic role, not even the most evil catalysts of the British imperialist barbarity knew that and could never have foreseen it, because they did not know yet what El Niño was. Well, know now that 1972-1973 was the year that Jupiter, the celestial body of good and bad harvests, according to the ancient Chinese of the first black spot logbooks, came down to walk on earth like a mortal, and he spoke with us. Weather satellites had for the first time gained enough omnipotence through human excellence in computing in the era of the space race to accurately analyze the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which governs all rain gods and weather on this planet.
今 nation.